Welcome to the Public Voice Salon. We are an open dialogue on culture and ideas with a special focus on education, the arts, and social change. And when you think about all of the art forms, okay, the most powerful in terms of communicating ideas to as many people as possible right now, movies are really the most popular art form, or at least have been for at least a century, okay? Now, most people think Hollywood was the beginning of the film industry. It actually is not true. Fort Lee, New Jersey was Hollywood before there was Hollywood. And we're sitting with the man, Tom Meyers, who is the head of the Fort Lee Film Commission, okay, who's probably done more than any human being to really generate interest and awareness for the fact that Fort Lee, of all places, cute little town on the Palisades, a little quaint little hamlet, was really the original Hollywood. So Tom, let's talk about that. Let's get right into it. And why Fort Lee? Why was Fort Lee chosen of all places to be Hollywood? Yeah.
Basically, people forget. They not only forget Hollywood, they forget New Jersey. I mean, not Hollywood, I'm sorry. They forget New York, New Jersey. And I love Hollywood. Don't get me wrong. I've been to Hollywood several times. I love it out there. There's a lot of great history out there, so it's not a competitive thing. Yeah. But in terms of getting the history correct, Thomas Edison had the first studio, the Black Maria. He's the father of the American film industry. One of the reasons the American film industry fled to Hollywood as well, because Thomas Edison was a tough customer, which we can get into later on. But so in 1893, he was making films, started making films in the Black Maria in West Orange, like The Sneeze, like The Kiss. Then he shot footage in Newark and in Manhattan and in Coney Island. But by the early 1900s, studios started cropping up on the East 14th Street. So they were basically taking brownstones and outfitting them as studios. And if they wanted exterior shots, they'd go to the roof. So it was very limiting in terms of the scenery you can get, and New York was very populated at the time, so it was not the easiest thing in the world to just take a camera out and make a film in the streets of New York. So at that same time, due to technology, the early 1900s, there was a new form of transportation, the subway system. So these film studios, like Biograph, they found out they could send a film crew for a nickel on the subway to 125th Street. There they would take the ferry across the Hudson to Edgewater, and on the other side, they found trolleys and eventually trucks and vehicles that would take them up to Fort Lee. And when they got to Fort Lee, they found a huge backlot, basically. If they turned the cameras to the east, they had the cliffs of the Palisades, and they could shoot action adventures. They took off to the north section of town, Coatesville, very sparsely populated, a lot of meadows, small cabins and cottages. They could shoot westerns and Civil War films. And if they went to Main Street, they had a very rural Main Street that could represent any Main Street in America in the early 1900s. So they started shooting here, and the big thing to remember is Fort Lee was a resort community back in the late 19th century. There were a lot of hotels on the Palisades, so the people of Fort Lee made their living catering to the resorts. And by 1898, we had Palisades Amusement Park open up, so a lot of people from New York were day trippers that came over here, and again, people from Fort Lee made their money. So whereas some communities would not welcome the film industry, Fort Lee people were very interested in making a buck. And when they saw people coming here to make movies, they saw a way to make money. So they welcomed the industry. And so they started using Fort Lee as a location as early as 1907. D.W. Griffith first had work in Fort Lee, not as a director, but as an actor for an Edison company, and he made a film called Rescued from an Eagle's Nest, which had an iconic image of a fake eagle carrying off a real baby. And then he ended up directing for Biograph, and he did not all, but most of his location footage between 1908 and 1912 was shot in Fort Lee. Some of it was in Cuddybackville, New York, and some of it out in California, but by and large, mostly Fort Lee. That came, along with other studios sending crews over here. By 1910, a company called Champion occupied a newly built studio built by the Wunsch family, who owned a lumber yard in nearby Angua Cliffs, and the the Champion, through Mark Dittenfast, started shooting films just right over the Fort Lee, Coatesville border and Angua Cliffs, although then it was called Coatesville as well. And Carl Laemmle was a German immigrant, went to Wisconsin, started working, I believe, in a men's clothing store. And then he came to Fort Lee with his independent motion picture company and started shooting a film here in 1909 called Hiawatha. By 1912, he buys the Champion studio up in Coatesville, and it becomes the first home to Universal Studios. So that's the first sense of a big studio born in Fort Lee. 3 years later, in 1915, William Fox sets up shop in Fort Lee and becomes Fox Studio. The French come to Fort Lee as early as 1911 with Eclair. The French at the time, before World War I, they were the most advanced country in terms of the quality of filmmaking, the technique of filmmaking. We would only surpass them after World War I. But the French were very good business people because they realized the largest audience for film in the world was America, so they felt they needed to establish studios in America, and they came to Fort Lee. Close on the heels of Eclair came Alice Guy-Blache. Now, remember, we were talking about Edison making these films in the 1890s called The Sneeze and The Kiss. Alice Guy-Blache was the daughter of a bookseller. So when she became a secretary for Gaumont in the 1890s, she wanted to make films. So Gaumont would let her make films on her lunch hour. And by 1902, she was the head of production of Gaumont, a woman. She was the first person, not just first woman, but first person, first filmmaker to make a narrative film. So it wasn't Griffith, it wasn't Edison. It was Alice Guy-Blache who made the first narrative film. She made some of the first color films. She made some of the first talking films as early as 1902, and she came to America with her husband Herbert I believe in 1910 or thereabouts, and they set up shop in Flushing, where she set up Solax. And quickly thereafter, she saw where the action was, the first American film town. Everything was being concentrated in Fort Lee. So she built a state-of-the-art studio for $100,000 in 1912 in Fort Lee. The only woman to date to build her own studio, own and operate it. Here she directed, produced, and wrote hundreds of films before women in this country had the right to vote. And she was an example of how the industry in Fort Lee went from the Nickelodeon period to the period when they were building picture palaces. So it really became an art form in Fort Lee. And she made some brilliant films. Falling Leaves, visually, is a brilliant film. The studio sets were gorgeous. She employed a lot of local people in Fort Lee. She lived in Fort Lee. See, a lot of the filmmakers like Laemmle and Fox commuted to Fort Lee. A lot of the actors commuted to Fort Lee. But the French lived in Fort Lee, so Alice lived on Lemoyne Avenue, a few blocks from her studio. She raised her children in Fort Lee, so she was a real resident of Fort Lee. So when you get to about 1915, there are as many as 17 working studios in Fort Lee. You had the north section of town with the Champion. You had Main Street with Fox and Universal. You had a concentration off of Linwood Avenue with 4 studios. You had the Paragon, and you had multiple production companies in each of these studios. So studios would rent space. We had Triangle. Keystone was operating out of a portion of the Fox studio as well. Once the industry, World War I came, that was the zenith of the industry in Fort Lee. Everything started to decline after that because there was a coal shortage, there was a flu epidemic, and Thomas Edison, although he was defeated in court, he was still troublesome to some of the filmmakers. And the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce was offering beautiful weather and lots of land. So Laemmle built the second Universal studio in Fort Lee in 1915. It was open, and it was for a short time the largest indoor studio in America. But at the same time, he took some land in California, and he had so much land he could incorporate into a city, and that's where Universal City is today. So the last big production he did at the Fort Lee Main Street studio was a great film that still survives, 1916, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. He shot the interiors in Fort Lee on the Main Street Universal. This was a film that did some of the first underwater photography and camera work, and he shot a lot of that off of the Bahamas, and it's a brilliant film. After that, he leased space to people like Sam Goldwyn. So Sam Goldwyn first came to Fort Lee and leased space from Solax and Alice Guy on Lemoyne Avenue. Then he went to the Universal. Then he went to Hollywood, and Louis Selznick leased all that space. So Selznick, by 1920, owned and operated most of the studio space in Fort Lee, where the others went to Hollywood. The last major production of a studio production was in 1925 in Fort Lee. After that, what happened in Fort Lee is we had filmmakers, independent filmmakers like Oscar Michaud, an African-American filmmaker who was prolific, couldn't work in Hollywood because of discrimination, but he made many films in Fort Lee from 1920 to 1948, his last film, and some of them included Symbol of the Unconquered, 1920, which was his answer to Birth of a Nation. Brilliant film, found and restored within the last few decades. He made the first all-talking, all-singing African-American musical called The Exile in a converted studio. They made it into a soundstage called Metropolitan on the Linwood Avenue area. And we had Yiddish language films, Italian language films produced in Fort Lee for immigrant audiences in urban America. We had the Mormons come in and shoot films, and now we're learning in the late 40s and early 50s, they may have been using some of these old studios for interiors for kitschy sci-fi films. And there's a film that was shot in 58 or 59, released in 62, called The Brain That Wouldn't Die. It's occasionally shown on Turner Classics. You can get the DVD. It's listed, the location list is listed as Westchester, but 90% of the locations in this film, we did a frame-by-frame analysis. I put these frames up on a site called I Grew Up in Fort Lee. I'm born in 61, so my memories is not as good as people older than me. So when I put these images up, they all knew where it was. So this film has images of Main Street, Old Palisade Road. It's a fun, kitschy film, The Brain That Wouldn't Die. But now we're trying to figure out if they may, in fact, have, instead of using interiors in Westchester, may have shot interiors in the Paragon. So this is another chapter of Fort Lee film history, like archaeology, we're trying to learn more about. I mean, it wasn't, they weren't making Gone with the Wind, but they were making something close to my heart, kitschy films a la Ed Wood, and I would love to learn more about that. Many people were employed in the industry in Fort Lee. My grandmother started, she was born in 1901, so when she was a child in the schools, they would let the schools out when they were making big productions in Fort Lee, and the studios would hire the kids for $1 a day, which was very good wages, and a box lunch. Later on, when she was a teenager in the 1910s, she worked for Eclair as a film cutter. My grandfather, her future husband, worked in the vaults of Fox. We just learned through Ancestry.com that his father and his brother worked for Paragon. But I always tell people, if you have relatives that date back to that period of time in Fort Lee, some of them, if not all of them, worked for the studios because it was a great paying job. And once the studios left, in 1931, Universal sold their property on Main Street to Consolidated Film Industries, which was Herbert J. Yates, who ran Republic Studios. And from 31 to 61, Consolidated Film Industries on Main Street in West Fort Lee, they had one of the largest laboratories in the country. And most of the studios in Hollywood, including RKO and Paramount, sent their negatives from Hollywood to be developed in Fort Lee. So you had 3 shifts working full-time, developing all these films that were distributed around the world. And this is before digital. So in those days, up until the last 10 years, studios would have to make massive amounts of prints, and it cost a lot of money. So they would make thousands of prints of each title of a film, and there were trucks that went around this property, and they went to the vaults, and they picked up all these films, and they delivered them all over the country to movie theaters and overseas to American servicemen. So it was a huge operation. My mom and my uncles worked there. My mom worked in the administration building. My uncle worked in the film labs. And there were gelatin factories there where they created one-sheets and lobby cards for promotional purposes. And I wish I had some of them. Recently, I went on eBay and bought a 6-sheet of a Republic title. It's not a big film. I think it was I can't even remember the title, but it was a movie serial from the early 50s with Lyle Talbot. But the Trader Tom of the Orient, I think it was, but it had Republic Consolidated on it, which means that poster was made in Fort Lee. So that was important for me. We're going to put that in our future museum. So that's the into the 1960s. You had after After Republic and Consolidated left, they sold their property to Bonded, which was a film storage company. They had been operating at what was once Solac Studio on Lemoyne Avenue. In '64, they came into the old, the old Universal Consolidated site. They tore down in '64 the old Universal Studio built in 1915. They built a massive amount of vaults and operated until the late '90s. And behind them, a building called the Brulter Building, or the San Jacques Building, was built by Jules Brulter, who was a very important person. He was a guy with Eastman Kodak. He brought a lot of the studios to Fort Lee. He built this building in 1922, and it eventually became a film storage facility. I worked in that building in the late '80s into the early '90s because NBC News was leasing space there for their archive. So I was working upstairs. Downstairs, the Museum of Modern Art had their entire collection there until the mid-'90s. It's still a film storage building owned by Iron Mountain, and we store our films there, including the earliest American film version of Robin Hood made by Eclair, 1912. We restored that film. It's stored there along with many of our other films.
Before Errol Flynn.
Before Errol Flynn, yeah. This is a bizarre little film. I'm a big fan of the Errol Flynn Robin Hood, but this is a bizarre little film. It's available on DVD now with a new score we put onto it. Milestone Films put out a DVD set called The Champion this past October, and if you're a fan of film and film history, you have to get it. We produced a documentary all about the film industry in Fort Lee, first documentary on Fort Lee film history since 1964, and Tom Hanlon's Before Hollywood. We have a lot of information Tom didn't have then in this film, including Alice Guy and Oscar Michaud. We go around to different sites in Fort Lee. We have a lot of great archival footage. We have the first documentary made about American film history in 1935 called Ghost Town. It was made by an amateur filmmaker, Theodore Huff, and he basically read a series of articles in the New York Times written in 1935 called Fort Lee, the Ghost Town of Film, and they came in and looked at all the studios that were dilapidated and everything, and they did a whole story on it. He came in, produced this film, no sound, and him and his son just took footage of the crumbling studios. The Eastman House has that. We got a digitized version from the Eastman House. We restored it, put a score to it. That's available for the first time on DVD. Robin Hood on DVD. 5 films, never before seen. The only surviving films of the Champion Studio in Fort Lee are on that, including The Indian Land Grab. I believe it's from 1910. It's an amazing film because it portrays Native Americans in a positive light in 1910. Amazing. In fact, they have scenes with the senator's daughter. Obviously, the senator was white. His daughter was white. And his daughter is fighting for the rights of this Native American chief who comes to Washington. And there's something hinted at a romance between a Native American chief and the senator's daughter, which is truly amazing in 1910. So it's worth getting, and you can get that off of Milestone Films. That's a company from New Jersey. Dennis Doros and Amy Heller, they're a husband and wife. They bring back a lot of films, both silent and not silent. One of my favorite films they restored and distributed, and a lot of their films end up being seen on at the Film Forum in New York, which is a great place. We love it too. I'm a member of the Film Forum, and Bruce Goldstein does a great job at programming. Yeah, so they show a lot of the films, and one of them was On the Bowery, which is a great film made by Lionel Rogus in the mid-'50s, and the people in it aren't actors. They're real guys who were living on the Bowery in those days, Skid Row, and it's an amazing film. So I got to know Dennis and Amy years ago, and when we did the documentary, they wanted to know what we were going to do with it, and we said we wanted to put it out on a set, and they said, well, let us do it, and they did, and it's turned a profit, and they didn't lose money on it, neither did we, so that's a good thing. So we consider it a success, and we're in pre-production for another documentary on the Barrymore family in Fort Lee that we want to open up our new center with a year from now. So that takes you from the beginning till today, pretty much.
Wow, Tom, this is amazing. This is a treasure trove of information about Fort Lee and its significance in the history of film. I could see this being used as curriculum on film schools. This is powerful stuff. Powerful stuff. Now, I have also a connection to Fort Lee. My dear grandmother, Doris Braden, her name was Doris Braden, was brought to America in 1909 by a famous actress named Blanche Walsh, who was America's version of Sarah Bernhardt on stage. But in 1912, Adolf Zucker created the first original feature film, which most people don't know about, called Resurrection, based on Tolstoy's third novel, a novel about love and social justice. Now, because that film was lost, and I'm thinking maybe it was made in Fort Lee, who knows, you know?
He had Artcraft was in Fort Lee. Zucker had Artcraft in Fort Lee, and obviously was out in Astoria. So Paramount has their roots back east. And Zucker had a prolific career. He lived to be at least 100, I think. 103. I remember they had a party when I was a kid in the early 70s, and I'm seeing this guy, and I was, I was a film fan then, and I knew who Adolf Zucker was, and I was amazed he was still alive. So that history is not that far removed from us in our lifetime.
Yeah. So the story with my grandmother, okay, she's brought to America by this actress. She winds up living in Coatesville, okay? Wow. So then she winds up working at Paragon Studios, okay? Not only as a film editor, but also as an extra in a film. So now, Claudia and I only discovered the other day on Google, we found this movie called A Girl's Folly, which was filmed at Paragon Studios. And could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that was a Maurice Turner film, and he's a great film. The French were so great. His films are fantastic, the ones he made in Fort Lee. And this is a great film. The studio, I believe, opened in 1915. That was the last major studio built in Fort Lee, and that film was shot in 1917. And it's about a young girl from the country who comes to the city to go to the studio and become an actress. And she's befriended by this actor who, Robert Warwick. Robert Warwick is a great actor. He went to Hollywood and he had a long career as a character actor. He was in a great Bogart film where he played a Shakespearean actor. A Lonely Place. That's a great film. He was in a lot of Preston Sturges films, and he's just a great actor. So he started in Fort Lee, Robert Warwick, and it's a great film because basically, when she goes to the studio, they have establishing shots, wide shot of John Street, with hundreds of people going to work in the morning. Just giving you an idea how many people were employed by just one studio in Fort Lee. Then they show the crew working on a set, and you see an overhead of all these sets shifting and being moved by the crew. The director is indicating that he wants the set to revolve, and these guys are revolving the set. There's a door that opens. You see all these women cutting film. You see shots of the commissary. So you get a sense. In a way, this is a great documentary. It's not made as a documentary, but it is a documentary on a day in the life of a studio in Fort Lee. And we, of the Film Commission, has used that footage for years. Every time we do a compilation of trying to get a sense of what the industry was like. And if you're interested to see some of that footage, the way we used it, go on barrymoorefilmcenter.org. That's a website we just established, and we're populating it as we speak. And our Film Commission website will eventually, by the end of this year, early next, be melded into that. It basically is a vehicle to learn more information about a film center under construction now that the Borough of Fort Lee is building, and the Film Commission will operate. It'll be a 260-seat cinema with an attached film museum, a second-floor archive and gallery, and it's going to be not only a place to exhibit our own artifacts, but we'll have traveling exhibits from other museums about the history of cinema, not just in Fort Lee, but the world. Our consulting partner is the Museum of the Moving Image, one of the premier film museums in the world. They are in Astoria, Queens, and we're very excited about having not only silent films, and we have a pit under the stage so we could have live music to accompany the silent films, but we're not going to be primarily showing silent films. We'll be showing new films from emerging filmmakers, art house films, foreign films, classic foreign films, classic American films. We'll work with embassies like the French Embassy to bring new filmmakers in from France to discuss their films, screen their films, and at the same time showcase the French films made in Fort Lee back in the day. We'll do that with other embassies such as the South Korean Embassy, because we have a large Korean population and Korea has a great film industry. Italian cinema, you name it, we'll be doing. And the work of new filmmakers, whether they're student filmmakers or young filmmakers. And we'll be running our own Fort Lee Film Commission film festivals, but we'll also be welcoming other film festivals from the tri-state area to call this their home. So every day and night of the week, there'll be something to see in Fort Lee in terms of film. We'll have a full stage. We could recreate film scenes in addition to showing the films. We could do music programs related to films. And during the week, we hope to have one of the best educational programs for students in the tri-state area where they could learn about film history and making films. And in the summer, we'll do filmmaker boot camps, which will end with a big film festival, Jersey Filmmakers of Tomorrow, which we have operated for since 2005. So it's going to connect that history from then to now, and hopefully we'll create a new generation of filmmakers in the spirit of the film industry. And the one thing I'll add is that this film center is literally built on the street, Main Street, where the industry was born. So right across the street, there was a bank that Griffith used that's still there, where he shot a film with Mabel Normand in 1911, Her Awakening. A block and a half away is where the first American gangster film was shot, Musketeers of Pig Alley in 1912, and that's why Scorsese came to Fort Lee in 1990 to shoot some scenes in Goodfellas that he could have caught in Queens. He came to Fort Lee as a tip of the hat to Musketeers of Pig Alley. Scorsese is very aware of the film history in Fort Lee, including that of Alice Guy. When we were working with the Directors Guild for years to get her honored, in 2011 they honored Alice along with other people at the DGA screening room on 57th Street. We were invited, and we had no idea who was going to do the honors. They showed a clip reel all about Alice in Fort Lee at her studio, and who comes out to talk about her but Martin Scorsese. And he talks about Fort Lee, and he talks about Solax. So this is a great tool, we think, to promote the history of early American film in Fort Lee, in New Jersey, and in New York City, predating what happened in Hollywood. And again, I'm a fan of Hollywood. I love going out there. I've been to Universal. I've talked to people in their archive, Fox as well. We love it out there. And they love the fact that this history is coming to light. And in this small little museum in 2012, we had a centennial exhibit to Universal, and even with this little museum, Universal sent elements of their archive and their prop department all the way to Fort Lee because they knew the history. So you could imagine when we have a real honest-to-goodness film center, our ability to work with studios like Universal to bring in exhibits straight from their vaults. I think that's going to be an amazing thing. And the other thing, speaking of vaults, we will have the capability in our projection booth to show 16 millimeter, 35 millimeter, 70 millimeter, and 4K digital films. Why 16? Because some titles are only available on collector's prints, and some of them are only available 16. 70, we have the capability of showing 70. So if you want to see, if we wanted to show a 70 millimeter version of Mad Mad World, which was shot in 70, we could show it in 70. So that gives us a lot of flexibility. We want to show film when we can show film. We want to make this an experience so people have an idea what it was like to see these films when they were released. And finally, we were very fortunate to have architects, Hugh Hardy and Associates. Hugh Hardy, for those who know anything about architecture history in New York City, he was a legendary New York City architect, and this was the last project he had a hand in. His team is fantastic. Daria Pizzetta, the lead architect. When we went to him, and the borough of Fort Lee and Mark Sockledge, our mayor, have been great. They allowed us to go to New York and within reason, go after an architectural firm that had experience in doing cinemas and museums. And this firm, H3, does smaller municipal projects, thus we're able to get them. But they also did the rehab of the New Amsterdam Theater for Disney, totally renovated, beautiful. They did Brooklyn Academy of Music, Lincoln Center, so they are very skilled. So when we looked to Hugh Hardy and we wanted to tell him what we wanted in terms of the way the cinema, the 260-seat cinema would look, we basically said we want something that looks very futuristic in terms of the 1920s. And he came up with a design straight out of Metropolis. And it's brilliant, and as soon as we saw it, we loved it. And that's the last thing we think he did before he passed away. The exterior is very, we think it's a very modern, yet modern design that 30 years from now it'll look modern. We wanted something that was very iconic looking, and it also will give us the ability, because there's glass windows wrapping around the cinema and museum, it'll give us the ability to do floor-to-ceiling backlit images images of all the stars and studios from Fort Lee. So on any given night when you're approaching Main Street, you'll see a floor-to-ceiling image of Theda Bara. You'll see a floor-to-ceiling image of all these great actors and actresses and studios. And we could swap them out for other images. So, for example, if we were honoring somebody, if we were lucky enough to get Martin Scorsese to come in, we would line those windows with images from his films, like Mean Streets, Goodfellas. So when you came down the street, you'd see all these great images. So we think visually it's going to be fantastic. And we got that idea when I was out in Hollywood. They have this hotel that looks old but is fairly new within the last 5 years called the Radbury. It's on Sunset and Vine across from Capitol Records. And when you go inside the hotel, they have a restaurant called Cleo's. And they have a floor-to-ceiling backlit image of Theda Bara as Cleopatra. And I saw that and I go, wow. And when you go to every floor, you get off the elevator on each floor, the big wall on the hallway has a backlit beautiful image of a Hollywood starlet, whether it's Marlene Dietrich, Anna Mae Wong, Carol Lombard. Amazing. And that's where I got the idea to use our images in the same way on the exterior of this building. So now people, when they come to Main Street in Fort Lee, whether they're residents for 50 years or they're just going to a restaurant and they come from New York City, they're going to see something special, and it's going to make them think, what happened here? And that's one of the things we want to be, a beacon for people to understand what happened here and why it's important.
Wow, wow. Claudia has a question. Yes, dear.
Why it calls the Barrymore?
Oh, sure.
Why did they call? Well, the question Claudia has is why did they call it the Barrymore Film Center? But before I get to that, I want to just a quick story. My grandmother Doris, who worked for the early Hollywood in Fort Lee, we were walking one time. I was a little boy. We used to take long walks together, and she paused very reverently on this corner, and she said, "John, you see that house, this old house?" I said, "Yeah." Looked like a kind of a mansion there, you know. She said, "John Barrymore lived in that house." It was like, and you tried to save that house, right? Didn't you?
That's how we named this the Barrymore Film Center. We formed the Film Commission in 2001. About 2 weeks later, we learned the Barrymore house was going to be developed and knocked down. So we in a short period of time, we had a lot of work. We got most of the community was behind us. We had a gentleman who still wants to remain anonymous, but he's a great guy, and he was a member of our Fort Lee Historical Society. He donated money, so our graphic artist created shirts, and it had an image of Barrymore. John Barrymore said, "Save the Barrymore house," and it had a battle cry, Reinhardt. Barrymore made a film, I believe it was in '37, called The Great Man Votes, and that was his war cry. Every time he got upset, he goes, "Reinhardt." So we filled the place full of people. We came within one vote of saving his house. And Mayor Alter at the time said if it was a tie, he would break the tie in favor of saving the house. And as it turns out, we lost by one vote, and they were going to tear the house down, which they did. And afterwards, we did reach out to Drew Barrymore. We came very close. Drew was waiting for the town to save it, and she was going to come in. And we had, after they knocked it down, we found out that HBO was interested in contributing a lot of money towards the restoration of that house because they wanted to use it as an arc for one of the actresses at the time, Sex and the City, where they were going to have her buy this dilapidated house in New Jersey and restore it. So we lost out on that. And when we were shooting, my friend and first chairman of the Film Commission, Lou Azzolini, and myself took video cameras, and we videotaped the tearing down of this house. And at the time, we didn't realize it, but a group of kids from a nearby school with their teachers came out to see it, and we have this beautiful little girl on videotape. They had sent petitions to the mayor and council to save this house, and the little girl, we said, she goes to us, "I hope Mr. Barrymore isn't upset we didn't save his house." And we said, "No, he's not upset with you." But we knew what we had to do. And Mayor Alter, after we lost the house, he said something that stuck with me many years, a decade and a half later. He said, "The Barrymore name is very magical in Fort Lee. Someday there'll be a proper facility that's worthy of their name." And when we finally were talking about this 5 years ago, I went to the mayor and council and petitioned them and the film commission did, to pass a resolution, what they did, to name this after the Barrymore family. Now, Maurice Barrymore lived in that original house. He was probably the greatest thespian in America. in the late 19th century, patriarch of the Barrymore family. He lived in his house from 1895 until he died in 1905. Never made any films, but he was a Broadway star, a very eccentric Broadway star. So he used to wear his silk pajamas on Sundays and have his fellow thespians from New York come over by ferry, and they would have adult beverages all day long. But on his front lawn, he had a fire pumper because he was also one of the founders of the Coatesville Volunteer Fire Department. They didn't have a firehouse or uniform, so one day, in the midst of this bacchanalia, they saw smoke on Myrtle Avenue. So they all ran, led by Barrymore. They brought the pumper to this chimney fire by a barn, and Old Man Coit, that was a Coatesville neighborhood of Fort Lee, still Coatesville. I grew up there. I still live there. The Coits were a group of family from Devonshire, England, that immigrated to that section of Fort Lee in the 1840s, and by 1895, they were all American hillbillies. So you have these Broadway thespians and hillbillies in the same community. So Old Man Coit said, "Don't worry, I put the fire out with salt. You can go back home." And Barrymore, Maurice, very theatrically goes, "You can't put out a fire with salt, my good man. Let her rip, boys." And this plume of water hits the old man's chimney and knocks it down. So Barrymore, the old man Coit, curses at the actors in Barrymore, in actors in general, Barrymore specific. And Barrymore didn't take it to heart. He said, "You know what? We're not getting respect because we don't have a firehouse and we don't have uniforms. So who's going to respect us?" At the same time, Ethel Barrymore, he had 3 children, Lionel, Ethel, and John. Now, Maurice's wife passed away when these kids were young. So John was raised by his grandmother on Long Island. He never spent any time with Maurice. But Ethel dropped John off in the Coatesville house at Hammond Avenue when he was 18 in 1900 and to spend a year with his dad to get to know him. So John traipsed up the front steps with a sketchbook. He wanted to be an artist. Maurice said, "Oh, no. If the Barrymores were plumbers, you'd be a plumber. We are actors. You, my son, are going to be an actor." So he decided to raise money for the building of a firehouse and to buy uniforms he would design by staging a play, a fundraiser. And he did it at the location of Main Street and Central Road, which today is across from Napoli Restaurant. Up until the 1970s, there was a structure there until the mid-70s. And when I was growing up, it was an electrical shop and a lamp store. But it was built at the late 1800s as a beer garden. A German family from Hoboken built it, a beer garden, an auditorium inside. It was called Buckheisters. So Barrymore leased it, and he directed a stage play called Man of the World. And out of that play in 1900, he raised enough money to build a firehouse. The building still stands, although it's not a firehouse since the late 50s. And he purchased and designed uniforms, of which that fire company in Coatesville still has them on display, and we have them in our archive. And his son, John Barrymore, made his stage debut as a lead in that play, Man of the World. So, separate from film, John Barrymore, one of the greatest actors in American history, made his stage debut in Fort Lee. We have a sign we put up there about 10 years ago on that corner. The mayor and council allowed us to do that. They recognize it as John Barrymore Way. So every year on his birthday, February 15th, and the weather is usually very dicey, we have wreath laying. And we originally, when we first started this, we went across the street and passed a bucket around the bar at a Napoli Restaurant. And each year we raised over $1,000 for the Fort Lee High School thespians in his name. And knowing John Barrymore, if any of you know John Barrymore, you'd have to know how much he would appreciate our efforts as they were done at a bar raising money for his. So he definitely appreciated that. Last year we laid the wreath and we did a program at IPIC, and we showed the documentary we produced. And once we have the Barrymore Film Center up, we'll still lay the wreath, and we want to get a plaque up there, permanent plaque up there, and then we'll go into the center and celebrate his birthday with films and a reception. So all of this is why we named it after the Barrymores. Now, after Maurice died, Lionel, Ethel, and John all made some of their first films in Fort Lee. Ethel worked with Metro out of Solax. John made some films at Paragon for Artcraft, and Lionel was one of the members of D.W. Griffith's Biograph Stock Company. He had a stock company of great actors and actresses, Mary Pickford, then Lillian Gish. He had Donald Crisp, and he had Lionel Barrymore. So Barrymore shot on location a lot of films in Fort Lee. Probably the best film he shot for Griffith was one he starred with Pickford called The New York Hat in 1912.
Right.
And
it's on YouTube. Right?
Well, it's on YouTube, and for years we had thought it was shot the church scenes out front of the church was shot in Coatesville on Washington Avenue at a church that was torn down in the late 70s called St. Stephen's. However, due to digital photography and a friend of ours who showed us his family album, and his family goes back to the 1860s in Fort Lee, Sean Kelly, and we had a new image that we hadn't seen before of Holy Trinity Church from about 1912. And we matched it to the image from the film, and clearly it was Holy Trinity. So we sent it to a film historian on our film commission, Richard Kozarski, who wrote a great book, Fort Lee, the Film Town, and Richard concurred, as did other film historians. So when we found that out, I went to the pastor at Holy Trinity, that's my parish up there, and we did a program in the church basement last October where we screened that film in the church where they shot the exteriors. So to be able to go back and find out all of this new history is wonderful. So that's a roundabout way of saying that's why this center is named after the Barrymore family. It's not going to be a museum to the Barrymores, although our first exhibit is going to be called the Barrymores, the Royal Family of Fort Lee. That'll be our first exhibit. But in general, it'll be exhibit to world cinema history, over there.
I feel like we're getting a PhD here in the history of cinema and the early days of cinema. But I wanted to also put a good word in for my dad, Jack Braden, who grew up at 23767 7th Street with my uncles George and Bill, okay? And my dad worked at the North Jersey Playhouse. He was an actor when he was a young man. He was in the play where Warren Beatty was discovered for Hollywood. Wow. That's another overlap between Hollywood. Was that the one? It was called Compulsion. Was Ludlam, he ran it, and then Robert Ludlam went out to the Playhouse on the Mall, created the first theater in a shopping mall in the United States. My dad went out there, worked backstage, so I have a lot of biographical connections to this.
Playbills in the archive upstairs when they used the old Grant Lee movie theater as that's where Ludlam started. So in the late 50s, early 60s, we have these playbills with Shelley Winters performing there. We have pictures of Pat O'Brien at Palisades Amusement Park, and we never figured why Pat O'Brien would be at Palisades Amusement Park in 1961. I'm a big Warner Brothers fan, and I love the Irish Mafia with Frankie McHugh and Jimmy Cagney and Pat O'Brien. And Pat O'Brien, we found out, because now we have the playbill, he was appearing in Finian's Rainbow at that company in Fort Lee for Ludlam. Right. Yeah, so we have a lot of those playbills. So that's a very interesting little-known history about the entertainment industry.
Now, one of our highlights of the summer, was going to Rambo's Tavern, which is actually the last structure remaining from the early days of cinema. You guys saved it. This little house that was like a hotel, and it's now actually being used as a house, but you put a plaque in front of it, and we had a wonderful time. You had a Dixieland band there. Talk a little bit about Rambo's Tavern.
Well, we have pictures. This exhibit that's at the museum will be up until the new film center is built. This museum will remain here, the Fort Lee Museum. It'll house the history of Fort Lee, everything but film. And there's a lot of history in Fort Lee. We have thousands of images of the bridge under construction, the 12 boxes of Revolutionary War artifacts, information about the Riviera nightclub. So this is going to stay here. We'll bring our film archive up there. But in saying that, the Rambo house, as a kid, again, I still live in that neighborhood, but when I was 10 years old in 1971, my friends and I in the summer would all had routes with the record. We delivered newspapers, but we also played a lot of stickball and wiffle ball in that neighborhood. And we'd occasionally take a break for cold soda. And instead of going to a 7-Eleven, we went to this little sleepy saloon in the center of First Street. And in those days, nobody thought about kids going to the saloon. It was fine. Today, forget it. But in those days, you could walk into that saloon or any saloon and get a Coke. So there was a cooler. I remember like yesterday. There was a cooler on the wall. We got our RC Cokes, and there was a table next to the cooler. That was this very table. That goes back to the movie industry. So there's a picture of it with Gus Becker there. And Gus Becker was a bartender. And Gus in 1971 was well into his 80s, and he died well into his 90s in the late 70s. And he'd tend bar. We'd sit on the bar stools. We'd have our sodas. He'd sell us handicap snacks, potato chips and stuff. And he'd start talking about the movie industry. And behind the bar, like Lily Langtry, he had a big poster signed to him by the first real star in American cinema history, Florence Lawrence. And it was signed to him, and his family still has that. We hope to get it on loan for the new film museum. And he all talked about Florence Lawrence. He talked about Pearl White. Now, Gus was born in New York City, came here as a young man. And so when he talked about Pearl White, he called her Poyle White. Poyle White. And he talked about the Barrymores. He knew Maurice Barrymore. He talked about Mabel Normand and Roscoe Arbuckle and Max Sennett. He was there when they were shooting a film, Max Sennett anyway. He talked about everybody who was shooting films then. So he was a living link to that history. Now, I learned, they didn't teach anything in school about this history. We learned it from our parents and uncles and my grandmother, but Gus made it come alive to us in that saloon. And that's where they were actually filming things in that saloon. So when I became an adult, I wanted to be a lawyer early on. I clerked for a lot of law firms in New York, but it wasn't for me. I worked for New York Life after college as a contracts writer, and I really didn't know what I exactly wanted to do. I always loved film and history, and one day I ended up getting hired by NBC News because of my writing ability, and I worked for NBC Archives in Fort Lee in one of the old film storage buildings, and then up in Englewood Cliffs at the NBC Exchange, and then for a decade I worked at NBC News before I came to Fort Lee. So I backed into this. So it goes from, Gus Beckers as a kid to then in the 70s learning more about the film history through Tom Hanlon and film screenings in a library. He showed us kids, we were learning about films silent in Fort Lee and outside Fort Lee through Tom. Then I joined the Historical Society. Then I started working in film archives, and then I got involved with the town, first as a councilman for 9 years, and then with the Historical Society working on this museum, and then forming the Film Commission. And all of that, to my mind, grew out of meeting Gus Becker as a kid, and decades later being able to go into that building and save it. Not just me, a group of us, including our mayor. But having that perspective now, to remember when I was a little kid going in there, listening to him, and then all these years later, so it was 80, 90, 100, it was almost 40 years later, more than 40 years ago, and remembering, almost 50 years ago, that's frightening, and to remember, that history and being able to save it. We do have a few other buildings still left in Fort Lee, the Brulter building, the Paragon, there's a modern office building, but that's just covered up. That's on John Street. That's the Paragon Administrative Building. That's still there. So there are a few elements left, but the one that's the best, you're absolutely right, is Rambo's. If you go down First Street, it looks pretty much exactly the way it did over 100 years ago. The building itself dates to the 1860s. It's the second oldest building left in Fort Lee. The first is Main Violin, which is a gorgeous Victorian on Summit, which we're very proud to have saved that too, and now it's a building that brings music to children, so we're very happy to be able to save these things. And we do film tours twice a year, film history tours, which you could just check our website, fortleefilm.org. Our next one's in October.
Wow. Now, we just want to tantalize our public a little bit here. Maybe we'll get our ratings up a little. But, Claudia, if you could focus on the image right up there of Theda Bara, Theda, who you say was the original Lady Gaga. Is that correct?
She was before Madonna. She was better. I'm a big fan of Madonna as a businesswoman. I think she was brilliant and is brilliant. I think no less brilliant and probably more brilliant was Theda Bara. Miss Bara came to Fort Lee in 1914 and 1915 for William Fox. She had made a film before this, The Stain, on the East Coast, and then she hooked up with Fox, and Fox had optioned this story from Rudyard Kipling called The Vampire, and that's where that was a source material for A Fool There Was. Essentially, she was playing a woman vampire, not a Bela Lugosi vampire, not sucking blood, but she would suck the life out of a man because she was so gorgeous and she was so destructive. And she was totally opposite in real life. But this image, she made dozens of films for Fox and Fort Lee. I mean, we have images in this exhibit and many more upstairs of the huge sets they built on the Fox back lot. They called her productions Theda Bara super productions because Fox was making millions of dollars off of Theda Bara films. And years ago, when we were going to designate through the mayor and council an intersection near the old studio, William Fox Way, and we thought about it and we said, no, we should name it Theda Bara Way, because all due respect to William Fox, if it wasn't for Theda Bara, there wouldn't be a Fox. So to this day, that's known as Theda Bara Way. This was a film she made in 1917, 101 years ago. That was made on the West Coast, Cleopatra. And
before Liz Taylor, there was Theda Bara.
Before Claudette Colbert. DeMille made the film Cleopatra. Interesting thing about Cleopatra, like many of her films, Fox stored all their silent films in a vault at Little Ferry, New Jersey. So I believe it was the mid-30s, 37, I think. I could be wrong. I don't have the material in front of me, and it's Saturday, and I'm a little tired. Okay. But it was definitely the mid-30s, and you could Google it. And there's images, if you Google it, of the fire out there. There was a big explosion in the nitrate vault, and among all of the films that were destroyed were most of her films, sans four of them still survived, and Cleopatra was lost. And there's only a few seconds of that film left. And what they did in those days in Fort Lee and Hollywood, they would have still photographers on set. So fortunately, we have tons of images in her in these provocative costumes, both in Fort Lee for other films and this film in particular. So if you look at this film at the time, I remember reading something at the time when they were reviewing this film, and one of the reviewers was saying that bra, snake bra, they said the snakes were holding on for dear life. There's another image of her with her both arms in the air, and I think she has a knife in her hand, and she was amazing. And that they couldn't get away with that in the early 30s once a production code was in. You wouldn't see anything like that till well into the 60s, and that was done, in the World War I era, which was amazing. The interesting thing about Theda Bara was she was also the first star where the studio created a PR story about her biography, which was 100% baloney. Fox hired these two guys in his studio to just create this biography. So when she started in Fort Lee in 1915, they had a press junket to her suite of apartments on Riverside Drive. She commuted every day into Fort Lee by ferry. And this suite, decorated by Fox, had very thick curtains, incense, snakes, and she was dressed very provocatively. And the bio went that her father was born on the sands of Egypt in the shadows of the pyramids. Her mother was a Parisian, and she was a very mystical woman, Theda Bara. And Theda Bara rolled with it. She was a very good businesswoman, but she also had a hell of a sense of humor. So when she got together with her friends, she threw her head back and laughed, and she goes, "They don't know it, but I'm just a nice Jewish girl from Cincinnati." She was a college graduate. She wanted to be a Broadway star and actress, but she ended up, getting into film. Wow. And she met a man, Charles Braben, who was a director, and she retired. She left Fox about 1920. Her last film was for Hal Roach, of all people, in California, in 1925, and she retired after that in Hollywood. And she was on the radio a few times. She talked about comebacks, but she never made another film. And she was very happy. She made cookies for the local kids. And I was telling you earlier, she never could have children of her own, her and her husband, but they lived next door to a family in Hollywood in the 1940s that had a little girl. And she kind of adopted the little girl, but the little girl years later wrote a biography, wrote about this period of time, and the book came out about 5 or 6 years ago. And she said, "I'm not so sure they adopted me or my family adopted her and her husband." And she got along so well with this little girl. When the little girl had plays in school, she would rehearse with her and everything else. So when Theda Bara died in the mid-50s, she left the little girl all those costumes, including that bra, that headset, that headpiece, and everything else. A few years ago, that little girl put them up for auction, and she sold them for millions of dollars to one collector in Australia who has that bra, that hat, and we're in the process of trying to reach out to him to see if we could bring some of that back to Fort Lee. But that that's a great story, and that indicates the type of person Theda Bara was. If you read about her, and there are several great biographies written about her, there was a documentary that was never released, but it was a great one, narrated by Dana Delaney. We saw in the Museum of the Modern Art years ago, and it was made by the Mary Pickford Institute, called The Woman with the Hungry Eyes. And that was her. If you look at her eyes, these images, there's an image over there of her from a film. Titles of her films were brilliant. Sin, you see that, Sin. They knew exactly what they were selling. And she raised a lot of money during World War I and war bond drives. She had a whole battalion of soldiers that loved her, and she adopted during the war. And there was an amazing, she was a worldwide phenomenon, not unlike Pearl White. Remember, this is before there was a need to have to translate language. I mean, you could show a silent film internationally, and maybe change the title cards, but that was it. So she was a worldwide star in her day, and she's one of the few silent film stars. People may not know her name, but they know that image of her, that face and those eyes. Yes. I was watching a film not that old. Oh, God, something with the kids. I can't remember. It was Annette Bening and Julianne Moore. The Kids Are All Right. I can't think of the title. It was a good film, and I think it is The Kids Are All Right. And at the end of that film, Julianne Moore and who did I just mention? Who's married to Warren Beatty?
Oh, Annette Bening.
Annette Bening. How could I forget Annette Bening? She's a great actress. Annette Bening and Julianne Moore play a couple who have a teenage daughter, and the daughter is going through a crisis, and they're arguing, and she runs into the room, and they're arguing with the daughter in the room, and all of a sudden, I'm not looking at them, I'm looking at a picture that this American teenager in the 21st century has on her wall, and it's an image of Theda Bara. Why? Why is Theda Bara? You won't see Mary Pickford on a wall. You'll see Theda Bara. It's a combination of those eyes and that gothic look. So that has transcended the decades, and that's why she's in many ways very relevant. And that's a woman who there's hardly any films left. Right. All that's left is the image. You have about 4 of her films, including A Fool There Was, but that's it. So you don't get a real sense of her as an actress, and that would be the best film if we could ever find that, Cleopatra, even though it's not a Fort Lee film. That's the one people would love to see the most. But that's the story of Theda Bara.
This is such a treat, and Claudia said we only have 3 minutes left, and there's a lot we didn't cover. We could save that for next time, like Perils of Pauline, we could go on. But Claudia and I are actually visiting my other grandmother, who's 98 years old, on Tom Hunter Road. We're heading over there now, and she also says nice things about you. I will too. So what you're doing is incredible. We're so happy and proud of what you're doing, because you're doing more than anybody, like you said, to keep alive this knowledge, this wisdom of Fort Lee as the birthplace of cinema, your passion, your enthusiasm, your articulation. It's just incredible. What keeps you going?
It's not just me. I have a great group. I have a great town, and we have a great mayor and council. I've lived in this town all my life. I've known many mayors. The first mayor I really got to know was Burt Ross, who had a great history in Fort Lee, and he's in California now. He's a great guy. And I've liked all the mayors I met, but I have to say the mayor and Jack Alter has a close place in my heart because of him essentially naming the Barrymore Film Center for us long before. I mean, he passed away long before we even had the concept of actually building a film center, although we always wanted to. But Mark Sokolich, who was one of the youngest mayors in Fort Lee history. Burt was the youngest, I think. But Mark loves the arts. He's brought Main Street back to life. He's had that area developed. He brought a cinema back to Fort Lee in terms of IPIC, and he could have gotten anything he wanted with the council in terms of a developer's agreement, and he chose a film center. So it's not just me. It wouldn't happen if it wasn't for Mark Sokolich and the council. And I have a lot of people behind the scenes helping me. Nelson Page, who is the chair of our film commission, and he's the chair of the Barrymore Film Center, and I'm the director of the Barrymore Film Center. Nelson is a retired now the motion picture theater exhibitor. He was in business for 33 years, had multiple locations in several states, and he operated and he restored the Lafayette Cinema in Suffern, New York. So, and he did a classic cinema series there. He did a lot of things. So he's a huge help to us. He's a consultant for the Mayor and Council on the building of this center, which is extremely helpful to us. Richard Kozarski, who's a member of our Film Commission of long standing, he's one of the preeminent film scholars in America of this period of silent film. He wrote the book before, Fort Lee, the Film Town. So it's people like that and tens and dozens of others that it's not just me. It's a group of us, and it's a group effort, and I have to thank every citizen in Fort Lee because we haven't heard one bad word against the expenditure the Mayor and Council has been making for this cinema and film museum. They all see the benefit of it, and we're a very diverse community. We have a lot of people who are immigrant families here, not unlike the way it was 100 years ago, and every section of this community ethnically has supported what we do, and we have many kids we've helped in terms of film programs, many of them Korean-American kids, and their parents have been so supportive of what we're doing here. So I think we have to be very grateful for the community we have because there's not many communities in America in this day and age that would support a project like this.
Well, we are so grateful for you, Tom, for the work you're doing and my own interest, our interest in Fort Lee as the birthplace of cinema. Let's continue to cover this. Yes. You know, we'd be happy to show up at your wreath-laying ceremonies and at the grand opening.
Well, we're going to have a groundbreaking. Hopefully you can come there. We're going to have an official groundbreaking. They started work already, but we'll have official groundbreaking sometime between mid-September and early October. So if you'd like to come, be our guest.
And since we talk about like the arts and social justice, I'm actually on a lecture tour now called Imagine a Hollywood for the Greater Good.
Yeah.
Imagine a Hollywood. And we're talking about maybe bringing it back to the East Coast, and who knows?
Tax credit now in New Jersey. We haven't had a tax credit for 8 years, so hopefully we'll get a lot more production in New Jersey.
I want to see the Oscars here in 2020.
Well, you'll see the Oscars simulcast here. I can guarantee you that. We'll have an Oscar party here. I think one of the things we can do at this film center is bring Hollywood back east in the sense of material, archival stuff, and people who work for the studios out there now. When they come to New York, we could host them for programs here. So I think that would be very cool.
Wonderful. Your work is so essential, Tom. We're so lucky to have you.
Thank you. Come back again, please.
Will do.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much.